So, the time is 1 p.m. and I declare the meeting, this open seminar with the Committee on Foreign Affairs, opened. My name is Aron Emilsson. I'm the chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs here in the Swedish Riksdag, and I'm honored to be able to host this seminar today. It's a great opportunity to discuss urgent matters with great analysts and experts in the House. So this seminar is public, and I would like to welcome the guests here in the first chamber, as well as those following us remotely. Before we begin, we kindly ask all members of the media also attending to please be mindful when taking photos and to ensure that your presence does not disrupt the proceedings. And thank you very much for your cooperation. So the theme of this agenda item is the SIPRI Yearbook 2026, but also a year that also marks the Institute's 60th anniversary. So let's highlight in this. Before we continue, I would like to provide some information regarding safety. The first chamber has 3 emergency exits. The administrative staff will indicate the best route in the event that an evacuation becomes necessary. In the event of an alarm or an incident, the administrative staff will investigate the cause and alert the Riksdagens Emergency Center. That concludes the safety information. We will now proceed to today's topic. SIPRI's Yearbook provides a comprehensive overview of key developments in international security, including military resources, armed conflicts, and global efforts in arms control and disarmament. Today, we will receive an overview of the deteriorating security situation for nuclear arms control, increased nuclear risks in Europe, and global trends in non-proliferation and disarmament. We will also be given a review of how artificial intelligence affects international peace and security, with a focus on military applications, cyber threats, disinformation, and the need for international governance. Furthermore, an analysis will be presented on the growing importance of outer space for civilian and military operations, emerging threats to space systems, and shortcomings in the current regulatory framework. Today's research presentations will take the form of a discussion moderated by SIPRI's director, Mr. Karim Haggag. And following the presentations, there will be a Q&A session in which pre-submitted questions from members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs will be addressed first, after which there will be an opportunity for questions from other participants if time permits it. So I would now like to give the floor to the Speaker of the Swedish Riksdag, Mr. Dr. Andreas Norlén, for an introductory address from the rostrum. Please welcome, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Excellencies, Mr. Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, members of Parliament, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. In a speech held in 1964, the Swedish Prime Minister, Tage Erlander, put forward the idea of establishing a peace research institute to commemorate Sweden's 150 years of unbroken peace. A Swedish Royal Commission, chaired by Alva Myrdal, subsequently proposed in its 1966 report that such an institute be established. The Swedish Parliament decided that the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, should be established on the 1st of July 1966. Today, 60 years on, the results of its research are frequently quoted in our parliamentary debate, and I think that a 60 years jubilee is worth commemorating. The decision to found SIPRI reflects the conviction that research and science are crucial elements in a free and successful society. They are also crucial for a dynamic public debate, free thought, and thus for democracy. We are living at a time when the security policy situation seems more uncertain than it has in a long time. Democracy is being put to the test, and great powers are trying to impose their will on other states through threats and violence. It is my firm belief that the best way for us as parliamentarians to promote peace and international security is to stand up for democracy, human rights, and a rules-based world order. Democracy is a prerequisite for peace, security, and prosperity. Exchanging thoughts and ideas through discussions and meetings is a crucial element of democracy. I therefore look forward to a fruitful exchange between science and politics at today's meeting. And I thank you all for being here today and bid you once again a warm welcome to the Swedish Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those words. I would now like to give the floor to the chair of the SIPRI Governing Board, Mr. Stefan Löfven. Please, welcome.
Thank you very much, Speaker of the Riksdag, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and other members, of course, of the Riksdag, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to thank the Foreign Affairs Committee for holding this important open meeting. It is an honor to be here and launch the 2026 SIPRI Yearbook, a launch that carries special significance as we also gather to commemorate SIPRI's 60th anniversary here in the Parliament, where SIPRI story actually began. The idea to create the Institute came at a time when Sweden was marking 150 years of peace, but also to a world living under the shadow of the Cold War confrontation and nuclear danger after the Cuban Missile Crisis. SIPRI was founded by Riksdagen in the summer of 1966. 2 years later, in 1968, SIPRI's first yearbook was published, giving a critical overview of global developments in armaments, disarmaments, and international security. The Institute regularly ranks among the most respected think tanks worldwide, being recognized as a highly trusted, independent source of data analysis and recommendations to policymakers. And SIPRI's databases have set global golden benchmarks. They serve as authoritative sources of information on military expenditure, arms transfers, and other aspects of international security. The databases are a global public good, promoting peace and transparency in an increasingly volatile global landscape. And in today's fractured information environment, they are important tools to combating misinformation and fostering informed debate. And in the international sphere, SIPRI's research has supported shaping of policies and processes that have defined international peace and security. Let me give you a few examples. SIPRI supported the establishment of historic agreements, such as the Chemical Weapons Convention. SIPRI conducted the first ever global review of decision-making protocols for launching nuclear weapons among all the world's nuclear-armed states. The Institute has been an important convener of important dialogues on regional security, including the Korean Peninsula and the Middle East region. And today, with a major war in Europe following the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, SIPRI has responded with critical analysis and authoritative data on global military expenditures and rearmament trends. Parliamentarians, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, SIPRI, I think, embodies the best of Sweden. Dedicated to open, publicly available, high-quality data and analysis to support decision-making, the Institute has consistently served as a space for constructive exchange, both in large gatherings, but also in quiet convening. Since its founding, SIPRI has been a powerful tool for Sweden's international cooperation and standing. In the rapidly changing security landscape, demand and interest in the Institute's activities have increased in recent years, both in Sweden but also internationally. As I speak, in a foreign ministry, UN agency, or regional organizations, SIPRI's data and analysis are being used to inform negotiations, shape national policies, or support international cooperation. Now, the world looked different when SIPRI was first founded 60 years ago. Many of the issues the international security has to deal with today, from climate change to AI, was nascent or non-existent concerns at the time. But what a foresight the Riksdag had when it founded this forward-looking institute. Now, as we will hear today in the discussions, SIPRI is a dynamic and agile institution focused on the most pressing issues facing international peace and security today, but also in the future. Reaching decision makers, researchers, and the public audiences across more than 170 countries, SIPRI has shown the world that an idea born in the halls of Swedish Parliament can bring invaluable information to millions of people around the globe. To conclude, thanks again to the Parliament, to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and to parliamentarians across the political spectrum for continuing to support SIPRI and for convening this very important meeting. I now look forward to what will surely be an insightful discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. I would now like to give the word to the Director of SIPRI, Mr. Karim Haggag, who will present and moderate the panel we will listen to as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, allow me at the outset to extend my warm appreciation to the honorable Speaker of the Riksdag, the Honorable Chair and Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, for granting us this opportunity to be with you here on this very special occasion. I would also very much like to acknowledge the efforts of the Deputy Director of the Institute, Ambassador Charlotta Spari, for really anchoring our engagement with the Riksdag as a whole, and to her and all of the colleagues at SIPRI for their contribution to making this event possible. So, Mr. Chairman, this is a very special occasion for SIPRI, not only because it marks the 60th anniversary of the founding of the institution, but also because it marks the launch of our yearbook. So the SIPRI Yearbook has really become synonymous with the brand of the institution overall. And that brand has been anchored in providing solid, evidence-based, high-quality research on the cutting-edge issues that relate to international peace and security. The SIPRI Yearbook is globally recognized as one of the most important reference works on issues of international peace and conflict. You will find this publication on the bookshelves of foreign ministry offices, ministries of defense, major libraries, and international organizations. The launch of the yearbook every year becomes a global news event, featured in thousands of news stories in major outlets internationally. And the fact that this publication features Stockholm on its cover is, I think, a testament to Sweden's soft power on these critical issues of international peace and security globally. So we thought it would be fitting to convene a small panel discussion on some of the key themes that have been featured in this year's yearbook, focusing in particular on the issues of nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence, and outer space. And for that purpose, I'm very happy that we have been able to bring together some of the foremost experts on these topics, both at SIPRI, but also recognized globally. To my left is Dr. Sibylle Bauer, the Director of Studies for Armament and Disarmament. To her left is Vincent Boulanin, who is a Senior Researcher and Director of the Governance of Artificial Intelligence Program at SIPRI. And then last but certainly not least is Nivedita Raju, who is a Senior Researcher in the SIPRI Weapons of Mass Destruction Program, focusing on issues of outer space. So, Sibylle, perhaps if I can start with you, focusing on the questions of nuclear weapons. The SIPRI Yearbook describes what is a very rapidly changing and fluid nuclear landscape. In your assessment, what are the key trends that you would identify that deserve particular focus? What should we be very focused on when we look at this very dynamic situation? And why are these issues important?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this very, very distinguished audience. Indeed, what we see is a rapidly changing and I think also rather worrying nuclear landscape. Let me just briefly summarize the key trends. First, an increasing salience of nuclear weapons. Second, modernization of nuclear weapons by all nuclear weapons possessing states. Third, we see a heightened risk of escalation, of miscalculation, and also risk of actual nuclear use because of geopolitical tensions and technological developments. At the same time, we have a breakdown of nuclear arms control and non-proliferation is under strain. We have a risk of further nuclear proliferation in Europe, in the Middle East, in East Asia, and there's also a risk of resumption of nuclear testing. Let me break it down a bit further. What's been happening now is that decades of efforts to reduce numbers and roles of nuclear weapons have now been reversed. To provide some figures, the 9 nuclear-armed states, so US, Russia, UK, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, all continue to modernize and enhance their nuclear arsenals in 2025. And most of them also deployed new nuclear weapons or nuclear-capable weapon systems. SIPRI now estimates that we have a total of just over 12,000 nuclear warheads globally, and most of them are in military stockpiles for potential use. And just over 2,000 of the deployed warheads were kept in a state of high operational alert on ballistic missiles, so mostly the Russian US ones. Also to keep in mind is that Russia and the US both are very likely to increase the size and diversity of their arsenals further in the coming years. A strong focus has also been on China. So SIPRI now estimates around 620 nuclear warheads in China, which is up from 320 just 6 years ago, so almost a doubling in that time period. And China is expanding its nuclear arsenal faster than any other country, and it showcased some new nuclear systems during its military parade last year. But what you also have to see when you put things into perspective that even should China reach by 2030 1,000 warheads, which is very possible, that would still be just 1/4 of what Russia and the US currently have. On France, you all know that in March, President Macron announced that he had ordered an increase in nuclear warheads and that the government would no longer publish the size of its arsenal. Similar trend in the UK, there may also be increases, and in the UK also there won't be the transparency that we used to see. India and Pakistan, which have been at war recently, as we know, continue to develop new types of nuclear delivery systems. And North Korea, also quite worrying, continues to develop its capabilities. It has the goal to exponentially expand its nuclear arsenal. SIPRI estimates that the country has now assembled 60 warheads and possesses enough fissile materials to produce at least 30 more. And it's also accelerating the production of fissile material. And last but not least, Israel is also believed to be modernizing its nuclear arsenal. So what we see are cross-cutting trends in the 9 nuclear-armed states, increasing opacity and ambiguity, also a lack of dialogue and direct communication between many of those states. And very importantly, and that connects with the next speakers, we can no longer assume that all leaders will receive accurate information and data during nuclear crisis. And one case in point is the rampant disinformation and AI-generated deepfakes that were part of the India-Pakistan conflict. To end, I should also point out that beyond the 9 nuclear-armed states, there are also, as we know, discussions in other countries about acquiring nuclear weapons, or at least revisiting the possibility of an indigenous nuclear capability. And that's something we could see not only in Europe, but also in East Asia and in the Middle East. So you will see, I have talked a lot about armament, but not so much about disarmament, because there's not so much disarmament ongoing at the moment. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Sibylle. No, a very important assessment and a sobering one, indeed. Vincent, if I can turn to you. So, artificial intelligence is the subject of much discussion and perhaps also much hype. And we do see the increasing use of artificial intelligence in the military domain, to the extent that this has become a dominant feature of today's armed conflicts. We see this, of course, in Ukraine. We have seen this to a very large extent in Gaza, and of course in the ongoing conflict between the United States and Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other hand. What are the key implications for international peace and security when it comes to these trends associated with artificial intelligence, and what are the prospects for risks when we see the integration of this technology in the military domain?
Thank you, Karim. And I can also extend my gratitude for being here and this opportunity. So I actually started to follow the topic of AI and warfare 12 years ago. It was actually, I was commissioned by the Swedish MFA to do a study to support the new conversation on autonomous weapons at the UN. And at the time, the topic was viewed as very futuristic. Not least because the technology was still in an early stage. But things have changed drastically over the last 5 years. The nexus between AI and warfare is a reality, and you mentioned the case of, Karim mentioned the case of Ukraine, Gaza, and Iran. And I think we were foreseeing 10 years ago that AI, one of the key features of AI would be that it would be used to kind of increase the autonomy in weapon systems, and it could notably allow like automated target recognition, and it could allow weapons to kind of navigate autonomously to their targets. And that was actually the core of the debate on autonomous weapons at the UN at the time, was this idea like we would move to a more autonomous targeting and autonomous warfare. But interestingly, like when we look at the recent conflict, a trend that we were not foreseeing that much at the time was how AI is used to supercharge military decision-making, and how it's what we call like the use of AI for decision support. And basically what we see is that in Ukraine, also in Israel, and in the case of the US, where they use AI to kind of digest tons of data from the battlefield, footage from drones, but also like information from various sources, and try to kind of put that into a single kind of picture to the military commanders. And so both kind of help them kind of make sense of the complexity of the battlefield, to reduce the fog of war somehow, but also to kind of increasingly also to give them predictions or recommendations about what could be possible course of action. And they use AI to do wargaming, simulations, and so on. And that's a clear trend that we see. So now, what are the implications for international peace and security? So in our work, I would say we would itemize three key trends. The first one is how would relate to the kind of strategic implication, mainly about how AI is impacting how states see their relative military capabilities and also their sense of security. We clearly see all the major powers see AI as a kind of key ingredient of modern warfare, and they want to accelerate the adoption of AI capabilities. And I think the challenge here is that is a bit of we can see states having kind of FOMO in terms of, they need to see, they want to accelerate the adoption, but the problem is that it could be done at the cost of the responsible adoption, right? So they could cut corners when it's come to testing and ensuring that the systems are reliable and that can be used lawfully. So that's one worrying trend, right? Another one is obviously that it could also lead some actors that are not able to compete to double down on the adoption of nuclear weapons, for instance, like DPRK. Another trend I wanted to highlight relates to more the humanitarian implications. And what we see with the use of AI decision support system is that the flip side of it is that it actually, so it allows militaries to kind of scale up the speed and the volume of attacks. But the problem is that it will then compress the time available for making assessments which are important for limiting the impact on civilians, right? So it compresses the time available to ensure that they fulfill their obligation under international humanitarian law, notably the key principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attack. And that's a challenge, not least because it could, in the end, also impact how states interpret their legal obligation in terms of what it means, for instance, to take precaution. And there's a bit of a risk of having AI humans just being like a rubber stamp of AI recommendation and just click on a button to validate AI-generated attack or course of action. And the third element that I wanted to highlight, it relates to proliferation. We talked a lot about the use of AI in warfare, but the reality is, and I think you're all aware of that the advances in AI come from the civilian sector, and a lot of this civilian innovation can be misused in harmful ways. And we have seen already a lot of cases of AI being misused for influence operation to scale up cyber attacks, but also possibly how civilian drones can be weaponized by terrorist groups. And that demands also attention, and I think maybe I'll turn back to that topic later on, but I think we also need to pay attention to the kind of peace and security implications of civilian developments as well, and ensure that companies that do develop systems are mindful of this risk.
Thank you very much, Vincent. So the conversation on both nuclear weapons, but also artificial intelligence is increasingly linked to outer space and the emergence of space as a significant domain of contemporary warfare. So Nivi, moving on to you, the emergence of space in armed conflicts has been a very prominent trend that we are observing. Again, the example of Ukraine comes to mind. What are the key implications for today's military uses of space, especially given that space is also integral for critical civilian use?
Thank you, Karim, and thank you all. Very grateful to be here as well. So let's start with how essential space is in today's everyday uses. It enables a number of critical civilian sectors, ranging from transportation to communications to navigation, even our financial markets. Space systems are critical for humanitarian operations, identifying safe passage for civilians in conflict zones, for example, or ensuring delivery of emergency relief. But as we all know, at the same time, space is critical for national security, enabling intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, providing secure communications, and missile early warning alerts. These services, they are increasingly provided by a number of states, but we're also seeing industry actors extremely prominent in this area. And with this growing dependence on outer space, we're also seeing a parallel rise in means to undermine these systems. A term called counterspace capabilities broadly refers to the varying means of disrupting, denying, degrading, or destroying space systems, and there's been a sharp rise in these capabilities. All these three aspects, growing dependence, industry actors, and the rise in capabilities, all three aspects are extremely visible in the ongoing war in Ukraine. We're seeing how space is a critical enabler, connecting drone feeds to artillery batteries, combating disinformation, enabling greater precision in targeting. And we're seeing the prominent role of commercial actors in the war. SIPRI's research has identified inconsistencies, for example, in Ukrainian armed forces' access to SpaceX's Starlink communication services during the course of the war. SpaceX has limited access to Starlink for the armed forces at certain stages of the conflict. And in 2015, we've also identified reports where the US was intending to use Starlink as a bargaining chip in its critical minerals deal with Ukraine. Now, all of these developments collectively, they have triggered the surge for European technology alternatives. But at the same time, the governance questions related to commercial actors in space military operations and conflicts, those remain unanswered. The reality is that these decisions are being taken in boardrooms with a lack of clarity on international law, and they have considerable influence on potential outcomes of entire conflicts and can contribute to escalation risks. We've also seen a sharp rise in cyber attacks and electronic warfare. Of course, with the in the early hours of Russia's invasion, the Viasat cyber attack, but since then, a sharp rise also in jamming and spoofing of navigation satellite signals, as we've even seen and been impacted here in Sweden. What's important to note about these incidents is that they are not only affecting the parties to a conflict, they are also affecting neighboring states. We've also seen a rise in counterspace capabilities that can have concerning impacts on strategic stability. The US has reported that Russia is developing a nuclear anti-satellite capability, though not actively deployed, which Russia has denied the allegations of. This has renewed fears of a potential nuclear detonation in space, the effects of which are well known. The 1962 US Starfish Prime test reminded everyone of what the concerning effects would be, indiscriminate effects in orbit, and also impacting critical infrastructure on Earth. And we've had a long-standing taboo against nuclear detonations in space. So to conduct such an act today would be extremely destabilizing, and it may even raise consideration of a nuclear response. And in 2025, we also saw that the US conducted a major shift in its missile defense policy with the introduction of Golden Dome. Formerly named the Iron Dome for America, this now pivots, the US has pivoted from intending to focus its missile defense on potential attacks from Iran and DPRK to now focus on peer and near-peer competitors, meaning China and Russia. There are major questions about the feasibility and the ambition of this initiative, particularly because it entails implementing a layer of space-based interceptors in orbit. These would amount to co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities as well, and it would be a significant point for arms control, given that it's the first time that a state has openly deployed these weapons in orbit. There are undeniable questions about what this would mean for strategic stability, whether it would incentivize China and Russia and other actors to consider pursuing similar capabilities. And it also raises questions for US allies, including in Europe, on commitments to responsible behaviors in space. Amid all of these developments, heightened competition, and over-reliance on strategic ambiguity, and shrinking avenues for communication, these developments really showcase how the space domain is integral in military operations and conflicts today, and that there is high potential for escalation related to the domain.
Thank you, Nivi. So all three of you have touched in your remarks on two issues in particular: the issues of risks when it comes to these emerging trends, and the challenges of governance, how to control these trends and military capabilities moving forward. So if I could maybe press you to think deeper about those two aspects in particular. Sibylle, starting with you, you've highlighted the increasing dangers of nuclear weapons especially in the context of the collapse of strategic arms control between the United States and Russia, the rapid buildup of China, the erosion of the global non-proliferation regime. How should we assess the seriousness of nuclear risks as they exist today?
The risk of nuclear weapons use has clearly increased, and I would assess that the risk of nuclear weapons use in Europe is higher than it's been for decades. And the escalation pathways that are possible are multiple, not just because of geopolitical tensions, and Russia seems to be more risk tolerant than many others, but you also have multi-domain dynamics. In addition to the traditional domains, which are land, sea, air, you have outer space, you have mental space, and you have cyberspace that are all becoming military domains. And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to predict and control cross-linkages between these domains. In addition, you also have tech developments in areas such as AI, but also quantum, that impact nuclear risk. So you have a risk of unintended escalation, and you also have the risk of unintended consequences of intended escalation. And the problem is that once escalation starts, no one is in full control. And how to de-escalate across different domains is something that no one has fully mastered. Also, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, is under very serious strain, and the NPT Review Conference that just concluded a few weeks ago could not reach a consensus outcome document. Trying to come up with some constructive, positive way forward, there are possible frameworks to mitigate nuclear risk. Firstly, I think it's very important to have functioning crisis communication channels, both diplomatically and military to military, and also discussions on strategic stability between the major powers. The recent summit between President Xi and President Trump provided some openings. The P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, actually also engaged during the NPT, and something constructive may come out of this, including in the area of emerging technologies, possibly in the field of artificial intelligence and nuclear risk. It's also extremely important to maintain the current taboo on nuclear testing. And experts assess that if large-scale testing were to resume, it's actually China and Russia that are the ones that would benefit the most. They have a lot to test. Last but not least, I think regional frameworks are very, very important, whether in East Asia, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And there's not only a need to address nuclear capabilities there, but also advanced conventional capabilities, because they can also feed into action-reaction dynamics, and there are also risks related to conventional nuclear entanglement and dual-capable systems. I'll leave it at that. Back to you.
Thank you, Sibylle. No, this is a very important insight into the complexities of not only the role of nuclear weapons in and of themselves, but the linkages between these other domains and technologies. So with that, perhaps I can turn back to Vincent. On the question of AI governance, so the yearbook highlights the key developments related to the different policy processes that touch on the governance of artificial intelligence. This has been a very difficult endeavor, and you and your team have tracked the different policy processes and attempts to formulate a governance framework for artificial intelligence. Why has the issue of AI governance proven to be so challenging?
Thank you, Karim. So just in terms of like the relationship between AI and peace and security in the kind of the policy context. So historically, the discussion very much started with, as I said, the topic of autonomous weapons. That was a bit more than 10 years ago in the context of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva. And SIPRI was one of the first organizations to kind of provide kind of research support to the discussion. And the discussion is actually still ongoing, and there's actually a deadline this year. There's a group of governmental experts that is mandated to come up with element of a possible international instrument on the topic. But as I said, like there are also other military use of AI that deserve attention. States realized that eventually, and actually a few years ago, the Dutch Parliament mandated the Dutch government to kind of come up with an international summit on the topic. Only led to a new discussion track called the REAIM track, so the Responsible AI in the Military Domain Summit. And there's been 3 editions so far in the Netherlands, in Korea, and in Spain. And it's a kind of multi-stakeholder summit, which is really useful. You have industry, civil society, and states. The problem is it's not a very inclusive summit, since, among others, Russia is not invited. So they also saw the need to also take up the discussion within the context of the UN, which has led to a resolution at the General Assembly. The Secretary General was mandated to do a report, and the latest development is that they're going to have an informal meeting in Geneva, and actually that's actually next week, so our team will be there in full and to assist the discussion and to engage with states. And that's the state when it comes to kind of the governance of military AI. But as I said, there's also like this nexus about the risk from civilian AI. Here, so that the conversation is still pretty young. The Secretary General did a panel on the topic, and they recommended to the creation of an international dialogue, a scientific committee. But the problem is that peace and security is clearly excluded from that mandate. So there's a bit of a gap in the discussion when it comes to that. Now, to your question about challenges, briefly, I see 3 challenges. One is conceptual. So when we talk about AI, it's a very fuzzy concept, right? It's how to delineate what exactly fits into the definition. 2, it's an enabling technology. So there's a lot of like meaningful use of AI, even in the military context. So it's hard to kind of delineate what should be limited or regulated. 3rd, there's also the institutional challenge. We know that UN processes are very slow and the technology is evolving very fast, right? And that's a major challenge. And 3rd, and more importantly, there's the political challenge. It's very hard in this context to have military powers, not least the US, China, and Russia, to commit to something that would a hard regulation on AI, and especially military use of AI. But I'm still optimist. You could think that we are currently in what you could call an arms control winter. It's really hard for states to come up with new legally binding instruments, but just the fact that they are discussing the topic is in itself meaningful. I mean, one of the value of arms control is also to have a process where states are in the same room, they share information, it contributes to kind of creating potentially the basis of possible future norms, and also it can help confidence building between major powers, right? So to have Russia, China, and the US to talk about AI and other emerging tech in the same room is in itself something positive. And I think that's something we are keen to support, either in the context of the formal meetings, but also we do a lot of like informal dialogues to that end. So with that, turn over the floor to you.
Thank you, Vincent. Nivi, staying on the challenges of governance when it comes to outer space. So we do have an existing governance framework centered on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. But of course, the domain of space, like all of the other domains we have been covering, is changing so rapidly that it seems that the existing framework is unable to keep pace with the rapid technological developments affecting the space domain. So what opportunities are there that we can think of for us to consider to mitigate the escalation risks that you have highlighted in your remarks?
Thanks, Karim. Well, to begin with, there are still a number of opportunities to enforce and to strengthen the international legal and normative framework. There are opportunities, in fact, at upcoming UN space security talks in Geneva next month, and there are opportunities here for Sweden to show leadership in this regard, in terms of steering potential risk reduction measures, implementing transparency and confidence-building measures that have already been adopted by consensus in past UN bodies as early as 2013, and also contributing to clarifying what these ambiguities are under the Outer Space Treaty. There are also opportunities perhaps for more cooperation with like-minded actors, perhaps Nordic partners, for example, demonstrating best practices on information sharing and exchanging points of contact. A second area to focus on is building common understandings on risk. And here there is much work to do. SIPRI's research and even our close dialogue convenings have exhibited that there are common misconceptions that China and Russia share the same priorities and risk tolerance when it comes to space security. These misconceptions largely stem from the fact that both states have submitted joint diplomatic proposals in different UN forums on space security. But as exhibited from our research, China is currently more risk-averse than Russia, given that it is more reliant on space for its national security needs, and also because it has these common interests in maintaining stability. It is the second largest user in space, of outer space today after the United States. A third area to focus on is understanding escalation thresholds and what may be legitimate or acceptable responses to a possible attack on a space system. For example, we've seen that NATO has declared that Article 5 applies to possible attacks on space systems. But this declaration alone cannot credibly deter attacks. We need to have more clear strategies for cohesion. What is considered an attack on a space system and what might be an acceptable lawful response? This is a difficult question to answer because there are so many different means and methods of undermining these systems, ranging from extremely destructive physical methods to non-destructive, non-kinetic methods. So there are many different types of effects and consequences as well. And as we know, NATO members rely on and use outer space in very different degrees. So these differences, they really show us that we have a need to have more clearly developed deterrence strategies and think about how that could apply to the space domain. Related, we're also seeing a trend of sovereign capability investment in space sectors across Europe, which we've highlighted in detail in our yearbook chapter. These are likely bolstered by overall unpredictability, the ongoing war, the shift in transatlantic relations, and the European need for strategic autonomy. However, these measures, these investments, they must be accompanied by strategies for risk reduction, compliance with international law, reassurance, and they should be coherent with European states' overall diplomacy strategies. Otherwise, they may not have that intended effect on adversaries. And finally, we also need to rethink strategies for space diplomacy. Often it's forgotten that space systems are tools for international diplomacy, and they can help enforce and adhere to help states enforce and adhere to the current international framework, while also benefiting from uses of space. Sweden has a unique role in this regard, both given its convening power, its ability to facilitate much-needed conversations, but as an emerging space power itself. There is great potential to convene more domestic stakeholder conversations, strengthen bilateral and multilateral cooperation, including with like-minded partners in Europe, but even cross-regional states with mutual interests, such as ROK and Japan, for instance. And there are opportunities also to engage with China on space security, civilian matters. We saw last month that the European Space Agency has renewed ties with the Chinese Academy of Sciences to conduct a scientific observation mission. And China and France have also renewed this cooperation. These types of missions are important because they help build trust, they help us identify where we are differing in our terminology and approaches, and even our operational and administrative structures. Ultimately, space is a shared domain, and if we want to continue using it, we are going to have to develop operational language and terminologies and procedures to use the domain and benefit from it to keep ensuring its stable use. Ultimately, to mitigate risk, we need a multi-pronged approach. We need to take dedicated measures at the multilateral, bilateral, and unilateral level to ensure that we continue compliance with the legal and normative framework and ensure continued peaceful and sustainable uses of space.
No, thank you very much to all of you. You have given us a very top-level overview of the key trends affecting the issues that you cover, but also, I think, a very insightful one in revealing the risks, the complexities, but also the opportunities that we need to be aware of to mitigate those risks. And maybe just a concluding comment from my end. What you've seen here is not just an overview of the research that is reflected in this year's yearbook, but also maybe a small example of the key highlights in our future research agenda. So all of these issues will be critically important when we assess, for example, the role of nuclear weapons in global security, but also as a very critical element in the future of the European security order moving forward. The role of technologies in affecting the changing nature of military competition, but also the changing nature of warfare, and the interlinkages between the domains, the different domains between the conventional, the nuclear, outer space, cyberspace, mental space, as Sibylle has pointed out for us. And then finally, the importance of looking at governance frameworks. On all of these issues, I think the importance of this type of research is not just that it is there to inform debate, but it is also there to inform policy. And this is very much aligned with the mission that SIPRI has taken upon itself to engage with key capitals and key stakeholders. And it is in that context that we very much look forward to our continued engagement with the Riksdag and the members of your committee, Mr. Chairman and Vice Chairman. And with that, let me turn it over to you, Mr. Chair, to open it up for questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let's give an applause for the panelists. Thank you very much for these interventions. I will now open up for questions and answers from the members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and I will take the questions in groups of 3, starting with the pre-submitted questions. And first on the list of speakers, I have Jacob Riesberg from the Green Party. Please, the floor is yours.
Oh, okay. I'll sit next to Margareta. Sorry. Thank you very much, and thank you for this introduction and the talk. It was very, very interesting. It's always it's kind of a festive occasion to get a new yearbook and read through it. I haven't had time to go through the whole yearbook yet, but I've read through the introduction. And I have a couple of questions. I hope you can answer them, even if it's not within your fields as you've presented them now. The first one is under the heading of addressing drivers of human insecurity. This, of course, talks about climate change and so on. But there's also this concept of climate-sensitive peace building and peace operations. And I haven't heard of this before, even though I'm both a Green Member of Parliament and also a previous student of peace and conflict studies. So if you could just give a short explanation of that concept. The other one is more of a reflection, perhaps you could say something about. In these times, we're talking very much about war, of course, and peace and security and so on. And the yearbook gives a good example or kind of grim example of how the world is addressing this. And it's always a lot of talk about armament, militarization, arms race, nuclear arms, etc. And when we talk about this, our first response is always to hook onto this as the first means of security, increasing our own military expenditure and so on. What I'm missing in all of this is the talk of could I say the other side when it comes to peace building, democratization, diplomacy, economic development, and poverty reduction, and so on. And how can we start talking about these issues while also talking about military expenditure? Because I think if we only focus on the ongoing wars, we won't see another future than actually more wars. If you could reflect on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will continue with giving the floor to Mr. Rasmus Giertz from the Sweden Democrats. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for very interesting presentations, I have two questions about nuclear deterrence and no proliferation. In SIPRI's Yearbook describes a development in which nuclear weapons are once again assuming a more central role in states' security strategies. While arms control is weakening, transparency is declining, and the risk of miscalculation and escalation is increasing. Against that backdrop, how does SIPRI assess that Sweden and the rest of Europe should balance continued efforts on arms control and non-proliferation with the need for credible military deterrence posture within NATO at a time when Russia is modernizing its nuclear capabilities and the European security order is deteriorated significantly? And how does SIPRI assess the prospect for the United States and Russia to restore or replace New START with a new strategic arms control agreement? In SIPRI's view, are these still realistic pathways back to limits on strategic nuclear arsenals, or are we instead moving towards a more prolonged period without functioning bilateral control between the world's two largest nuclear powers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, during the first round, Mr. Johansson from the Left Party.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think listening to academic and institutes like yours is open up politicians' minds and also adding new important information to the discussion. This morning I had the opportunity to be in Uppsala listening to your younger sort of sister institute of Alva Myrdal Center and Professor Mary Kaldor, who emphasize that she has belonged to SIPRI many years before. So I think you have also an important role of giving new academia opportunities. I think about what we see now is both AI and space are a lot of lacking of policies, even though there are some older conventions. Most of the space is the lack of political conclusions. When it comes to nuclear, you see a lot of lack of following those convention and process that have been ongoing for many, many years. And most of those recommendations that I hear you talk about today is towards governments and what government should do. But 60 years ago, this parliament decided to make a wise decision of making SIPRI starts, founding SIPRI. So if you were an MP today, what decision would you make then, or what proposal would you put on the table for changing the trajectory of what we are seeing at the moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that reverse perspective as well. You're interesting. Please, I give the floor to you to share the questions how you like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those very insightful and pointed questions. Maybe if I can start from reverse order, turning to Nivi and Vincent on the questions related to outer space and AI, and then moving to Sibylle, and maybe I will say something at the end.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for the great questions. If I may, I might answer your second question about the other side, how we can pay attention to all of these issues together, and I can answer only from the perspective of working on space security and international law issues. To me, they do go hand in hand. I don't think they're two sides of the same coin. Yes, we are looking at developments and conflicts. Yes, we are looking at trends in militarization. That also means we have to invest equal efforts in stability and risk reduction, if not more urgently than ever. And we have seen trends in the decline in transparency. We're seeing this even in the space, the cyber domains. It's very difficult to get more information on what's actually happening in these operations. And so, to me, I would say that we do have to put in best efforts towards risk reduction, and we do have opportunities for that. There are measures that have been agreed upon by states, by consensus in previous years, in terms of practices for sharing and disclosing more information on national expenditures, for example, on notifying when maneuvers are being conducted. So there are opportunities which are not so impossible, I would say, to still pursue those two pieces together. And also on the question on the issue of deterrence and thinking about how to possibly credibly deter, again, thinking about this with from the perspective of the space domain, we've seen that there might be some strategies to broadly deter all types of threats to all types of space systems. We can't have that kind of thinking successfully imposed to the space domain, which is why I mentioned in my remarks we need to have more nuanced conversations. Thinking about it, maybe drawing lessons from cyber, for example. For the last very interesting question, perhaps an entire hour could be devoted to that session, but I will mention 3 specific areas for my domain. The first would be on the legal aspects. There is still a lack of clarity on what constitutes a use of force when it comes to space attacks on space systems. And we've seen for that reason this rise in gray zone activity, cyber attacks, jamming, spoofing, because it's unclear when that might cross the threshold of use of force. But what we've also understood from some of our dialogue convenings, there are some stakeholders that are concerned that if they define that, defining a red line would only urge more actors to cross it, and may also give more impetus to the abuse of the right of self-defense, which we've seen states aim to expand further and further today. The right of self-defense under the UN Charter, this can only be exercised if an armed attack is imminent, and it needs to be exercised with the principles of proportionality and necessity. We have not had these discussions on how these principles of the UN Charter will apply to the space domain. Those talks have not been had at length in UN forums as yet, and even in closed dialogue sessions, there's a lot of hesitation to talk about it. So I would say the first step is to have these conversations and learn what different views and opinions are on how to take that interpretation forward. The second, I would say, is on implementing the transparency and confidence building measures that we already have. If there is one takeaway I would request you all to return home with from today, yes, our laws are weak when it comes to space. Yes, international law, there's much to improve on, but it's still there. We still have binding frameworks in place, and even for the space domain, there are still certain things you can't do. Placement of WMD in orbit, that is a binding obligation for all actors. We can reinforce these norms, reaffirm them, and remind actors that there are consequences for violating these actions. And finally, for commercial actors, this is also another area where we've not been able to have a dedicated discussion, again, in UN forums, and it is an area that we urgently need to draw our attention to. What are the roles and obligations of these actors in conflicts? They should also be made aware of how their decisions, their signaling, can also contribute to escalation. So these are the 3 areas I would focus on.
Thank you. Vincent.
Thank you. I'll focus on the last question from our colleague from the Vänsterpartiet. So first I will just underline, and I think it ties to what Nivi just said. When it comes to kind of AI, we are not in a pure kind of Wild West. There are already like existing law that applies to AI. So in the military context, like we have international humanitarian law, and then in the national context, European context, there are like regulations that are related to digital technologies and so on. I think the big challenge is how to ensure that we understand how this actually apply, and to what extent they are suited for purpose, and where there may be issues related to the implementation or ensuring accountability when these are not followed by either AI stakeholders from industry or some of the users and so on. So, and that brings me to your second part of the questions about what MP, like parliamentarians, can do. Focusing maybe on the Swedish context, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the fact that historically parliaments have the ability to conduct studies and create commissions to do things, right? And in a lot of the work that we do is in my team is related to doing technology impact assessment. It's about taking technologies and understanding the possible societal consequences related to the development and use of such technologies. So we focus on AI, but there could be other technologies like quantum and so on. So I think reinforcing and showing that the Swedish Parliament has this ability to do this type of kind of foresight and analysis of how advances in science and technology can have unintended negative consequences on society is a critical element to ensure that the community of parliamentarians is able to retrieve that useful insight, to be able to kind of, for instance, flag if there are issues with where there are gaps in the existing regulations, and if so, like how the conversation about possible new regulation can be framed and informed, right? So supporting either like commission work or work within the bureaucratic organization of the parliament would be, I think, very useful, and it applies to notably to the risk that I mentioned of the civilian uses of AI, and how, for instance, like advanced in civilian can be misused for influence operation, for cyber attacks, for other type of criminal activities. I think they could be work done by the parliament to kind of inform and support discussion in terms of what can Sweden do in the national context to either prevent or mitigate some of these risks, right? But it's not just limited to the security issues, right? So it's beyond what we do at SIPRI, but there are also a lot of societal, issues related to the proliferation of AI tools and capabilities that have like deep and maybe long-term consequences for society. And I'm a parent, I have a kid, thinking of the cognitive impact of our increasing reliance on such tools is something that I think the politicians should be mindful of and actually start really thinking deeply about the kind of the tidal wave that is coming with the current kind of digital revolution that we see today with AI. And I think it's beyond just the security realm. I think there are a lot of things, and parliamentarians are very well placed to kind of support the kind of the groundwork for policy making in that respect.
Thank you, Vincent.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting questions. The questions on the introduction I will leave to Karim, but I should also point out that on the peace and development issues, we have a number of colleagues at SIPRI who I would be sure would be very happy to brief the Foreign Affairs Committee if you invited them and to elaborate exactly on the topics that were raised in the first question. But I should also point out that in the armament and disarmament team, we actually do a lot of work on governance questions, on responsible research and innovation, on education and capacity, on engaging with civil society, on training journalists. So I think a lot of them actually overlap and are quite linked, and very much also the importance of diplomacy in international institutions. So this is something that is very much core to what we do. On the arms control question, that's a really, really interesting one. Sometimes I think there is a false binary that is presented as in arms control versus security. When you talk to people who actually were very much engaged in arms control negotiations and treaties during the Cold War, they're always surprised because they say you do arms control with your enemies and not with your friends. It's because you do not trust somebody that you have arms control. That's why you've had these discussions and the engagement between the Soviet Union and the United States over all of these years. And it actually helps also to create some predictability and try to understand signaling. Nuclear deterrence is very much about signaling. But if you don't understand what arrives on the other side, what they actually understand and what signals they send back, it can get very dangerous because once escalation gets out of hand, none of us may be here anymore. So it's something that is very important to understand. So yes, Sweden will invest in capabilities. Europe will invest in strategic autonomy, and there's a very long way to go to be able actually to do that, to have secure supply chains, and to not be able to not depend on other countries and other regions and the United States to the extent that is the case now. But investing in arms control goes hand in hand. That's why you need, if you do arm, you need to invest also in crisis communication channels. It's really, really crucial. And often it's when you engage with quite senior militaries that you hear about the importance of arms control. I find that really, really striking. It's the military often they understand, they know that they need to talk to their counterparts and they know they need to think about de-escalation strategies and think through these. Having said that, arms control in the future may look quite different. partly also because the way technology evolves doesn't quite fit into the institutional and legal structures and treaties that we've developed. We still need them. We need the NPT, we need the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Arms Trade Treaty, but a lot of the new technologies, AI, but also quantum technologies and others, they don't quite fit into those boxes, and the biggest risks may arise from the connection between these technologies. But to understand them, you actually need to engage with the technical scientists and the technical experts who understand what kind of escalation risks may arise out of those. So that's one of the big points. And actually that takes me also to the very interesting third question about what Parliament could do. I was actually first in Sweden in the context of my PhD thesis 25 years ago, which was about the role of Parliament in arms export policies. So I actually studied the role of the Swedish Parliament in depth in this field, but also the role of other parliaments. So I'm a big believer in the role and importance of Parliament in peace and security questions. One issue is, of course, budget. Parliament has the key role in deciding what the priorities are. Not just political priorities, but where the money goes in many of these issues, but also in treaty ratification, placing priorities in terms of issues, asking the difficult questions. Also engagement, funding education. One of the very positive fields that we've engaged with at SIPRI is investing in educating the next generation, not just in Sweden and Europe, but internationally, and bringing in also the technical sciences. When you study biology today, you never hear about the Biological Weapons Convention. You study engineering, you don't learn about peace and security risks and legal frameworks. That's something also where Parliament could actually initiate or maybe even create an obligation to study these very important issues. So I think that there is a lot that can be done by Parliament, also by communicating with your peers in other countries and having joint initiatives and putting issues on the agenda that really need to be prioritized. Balancing human security spending, bringing it back to the first question. When you think about military spending, there's also a very big question about what other spending requirements we have. And a lot of them is in climate change and human security, education and health. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe a very quick response to the honourable member from the Green Party who asked about the introduction to the yearbook. So thank you for reading the introduction. So one overarching theme in the introduction was about the breakdown of frameworks. So as has been discussed, the breakdown of arms control frameworks, security frameworks, alliance frameworks, multilateralism. And among the key challenges there is the breakdown of peace frameworks, so conflict resolution frameworks, conflict management frameworks. And therefore, one key conclusion that we posed as part of the introduction to the yearbook was that it's very important for peace research to focus on how we can rebuild these frameworks. And that brings us to the question that you posed. So on the linkages between environment and peace. So this has long been recognized that climate has emerged as a driver of conflict and a driver of human insecurity, a source of human insecurity. And the introduction tried to introduce the idea that as we rebuild frameworks for peace building, for conflict resolution, that process has to be done in a way that is sensitive to climate concerns. So, for example, when we talk about post-conflict reconstruction, how can we reimagine post-conflict reconstruction in a way that facilitates the green transition? Ukraine is a very interesting example here, and we have done work and research on this topic, how the reconstruction effort in a post-war scenario for Ukraine can be done in a way that is climate sensitive, that does make use of green technologies, and that makes Ukraine more resilient to the effects of climate change moving forward. So that's just one example of how peace research can imagine different futures when we reconstruct these frameworks. Over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. So in the second round, I have the following on the list of speakers. Let's begin with Ms. Margareta Cederfelt from the Moderate Party, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also thank you to SIPRI for the very interesting presentation. My question is quite similar to the earlier question, but I would appreciate anyway to get an answer on it. One of the themes of today's seminar is on analysis of the growing importance of space for civilization. For civilian and military operations, emerging threats to space systems. How shortcomings in the current regulatory framework may increase the risk of escalation and possible ways forward. I have a question regarding those shortcomings in the current regulatory framework. A space is becoming increasingly important, not least from a security and defense perspective. We want Europe and Sweden to strengthen our capacity in the space domain. In your view, which gaps or shortcomings in the current regulatory framework are the most urgent to address? I ask this because we are lawmakers, and for us it's very important to know what you see as the important questions that we should keep an extra eye on so we can support the Swedish and European work on space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's continue with Ms. Annika Strandhäll from the Social Democratic Party. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and first of all, thank you for your excellent contributions. And also, I think, more importantly, SIPRI's unique contribution in this time that we are living in. You know, this evidence-based analysis that you provide us as policymakers with in a time where the international debate is often driven by political narratives and short-term events. It's really valuable, so thank you for that. And now over to my question, and I have had the privilege before to listen to Dr. Bauer, and I'm also going to talk about the nuclear situation. Looking at the development, and do you see it, the nuclear development, as a temporary response to the geopolitical situation that we are living in today? Or do you see it as more of a fundamental shift in international security, where nuclear weapons can be expected again to become a central tool or statecraft for a long time ahead? And if so, what do you think that this means for the future of arms control? We have spoken a little about that so far, but also the work with nuclear risk reduction. And finally, also, several of my colleagues has asked you questions as parliamentarians, and I also want to do that as a policymaker. What do you think should be the most important things to pay attention to today if we want to reduce nuclear risks and prevent the trend to become defining for our future when it comes to the international security order? So I would be very interested to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll leave the floor to Mr. Karim Haggag once again to coordinate the answers of these questions. You have about 7 minutes or so.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm conscious of the time, so perhaps I could turn to Nivi to address, I think, a very important question from the honorable member from the Moderate Party about the role of Europe and Sweden on the issue of space governance.
Thank you, and a very important question that is. I'll start by saying that the Outer Space Treaty, it's an interesting framework because unlike a lot of other conventions, it doesn't have an annual review conference. And so the ways in which space governance and related arms control measures are discussed is sort of across different forums. When I describe some of the shortcomings, well, in the treaty, there's only this one binding provision that WMD should not be placed in orbit, which means the other means of attacking and undermining space systems are not clearly regulated. And that is the area where I would say we need to focus on. There has been a long-standing kinetic attack taboo, so we've never seen a state conduct a kinetic strike against an adversary space system, and this is something that we need to reinforce and make clear that this would be a violation, this would amount to a use of force under international law. This is something that we can more clearly say in upcoming space security talks. We can also maybe provide more clarity on interpretation of the ambiguous terms and obligations in the Outer Space Treaty, perhaps focusing on, for example, there's Article 9, which uses a term potentially harmful interference. What exactly amounts to potentially harmful interference? When is that obligation to consult with another actor triggered? We can focus on interpreting that obligation as well. Another area, I mentioned this in my remarks before, with the introduction of the US Golden Dome initiative, the potential for space-based interceptors, this is quite an alarming development for all actors. Space-based interceptors, these would be placed in orbit, and it's important to remember that when placed in orbit, they don't just hover. They will be revolving around the Earth. And so the scale and the feasibility of this initiative has been questioned by experts because it would entail having possibly tens of thousands of interceptors in orbit. So strongly urging our ally maybe not to pursue this particular initiative, and there are also considerable debates about whether this will be implemented given the financial estimates, which currently there's been $185 billion that's been committed by the US administration, but independent assessments range up to $500 billion, and more recent ones suggest $1.2 trillion. So also urging that this particular development be restrained and show some level of constraining this particular missile defense development. And finally, you'd mentioned in the beginning of your remarks that yes, space is critical for civilian services. We still don't understand what disruption of services, what those impacts on civilians might look like. It could be very different. For example, jamming navigation signals could disrupt civilian aircraft that rely on those signals. That could mean direct injury to civilians in that regard. But cyber attacks, they could have a cyber attack on a space system that could have long drawn-out effects over a period of time. So a cyber attack, for example, on navigation signals that are responsible for synchronization of a power grid and energy sector, how does that potential attack then impact civilians? We need to conduct studies to fully understand this. And there, again, has not been any dedicated discussion on how to adopt these measures in any of our forums till date. But I know that that's a basket of measures, but I hope that was useful.
Thank you, Nivi. Sibylle, the very important question on the future of arms control and risk reduction in mitigating the dangers of nuclear weapons.
There's so much to say in response to your fantastic question. So I'll just make a few brief points, but I'd be very happy to follow up on that at another occasion. I think we are at a very crucial decision-making point here, which could go in the direction of a very fundamental shift that could happen. And the fundamental shift that would happen is not only if the number of nuclear weapons increases and the role of nuclear weapons in the countries that currently possess them, but additional countries acquiring nuclear weapons. Because once that lid is off, and we have additional nuclear powers in the Middle East, possibly Japan, South Korea, there are discussions, Brazil and many other countries may actually have a very different world to navigate. And if you combine that with the technological developments, scenarios of cyber hacking into nuclear command and control, non-state actors, terrorists playing part of the game, we may be in a situation of a nuclear war that nobody wanted. So working back from that, how to avoid that, risk reduction is definitely one of the key priorities, as is crisis communication, and also more broadly, bringing the temperature down. Because if the temperature is very high and something bad happens, it's really, really possible that things will get out of hand. So really investing in these in the institutions and the mitigation factors in diplomatic capacities will be very important, but also investing in relations with countries such as China. I think there's a huge potential for Europe and China to engage. And there's a big lack of understanding how things function in China, the interest that Nivi pointed out also of China in stability and predictability. I think there's actually a lot of overlapping interest between China and Europe that could be explored and invested in, and that we all have a shared interest in moving forward. So I think the good news, because we've talked a lot about bad things, the good news is I think there's actually a lot of scope for action in its a really, really important point in history at which we need the best and the brightest to mobilize, because I think this is really the point in history where we stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Sibylle. Mr. Chairman, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for all your remarks and interventions today. And now we are beginning to reach the end of this session, so I will leave the floor to Vice Chair Morgan Johansson for concluding remarks and to end the session. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me give a thank to SIPRI, not just for this seminar and this report and yearbook, but also, of course, for your 60 years of outstanding work on research on peace and security. You are an institution that has become an international and global authority in this research field. You are highly respected, and we as Swedes are very proud to host so many well-known researchers from all over the world here in our country. This year's report that we've discussed today is, in my perspective, particularly interesting and in many ways scary, because you see, we've had this seminar and you don't shout the message, you use a very low voice, but in fact what you're really saying, if we see what the message is and we understand that message, this much of what is said here in this book, it is in many ways a red flag. It is an alarm, in my perspective, an alarm bell for where we are heading as a world. And in many aspects, the alarm bell is ringing. I think that has become very clear also during this seminar. We hear it in the presentation of space as an escalating area of conflict which open up new and troubling future scenarios. I heard your call on Swedish leadership, Ms. Raju, and I certainly hope that we can show that leadership in coming years. The same goes for AI, where we are, just as we understand it, in the beginning of a development where it is impossible to see the effects and risks, even though, of course, we all feel that both effects and risks will be huge. For instance, when it comes to the development of different kinds of autonomous weapons, an area which still is unregulated, which is a very big problem. And I really think that Sweden should take the lead also in such a process in coming years and give priority for pushing for an international regulation on autonomous weapons. And it certainly goes for the third theme that we've had today, the theme on nuclear weapons and the threat from that. Let me say something about that, because that aspect is really very close to my heart. For the first time in many decades, we see a nuclear threat that is increasing, and it is, as we understand it, increasing fast. We heard now on this seminar that the nuclear arsenals are increasing in numbers. The nuclear weapons are being modernized. The dialogue between the nuclear weapon states seems to have come to a halt. The new START agreement is no longer in force. The NPT negotiations in the UN failed again. And may I say, I was actually in New York in the beginning of those negotiations on the NPT treaty, and it seemed that there was some kind of defeatism in the air, that people didn't count on that this would actually be a success. And for me, the most important meeting during that week was when I met with a number of survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the so-called Hibakusha. And that meeting was in a way, a reminder what kind of weapons that nuclear weapons are. It is a weapon directly targeting civilians. It is a weapon that doesn't just kill when it explodes. It kills weeks and years and even decades afterwards due to the effects of radiation. And it is the only weapon that can cause escalation effects that can undermine the very existence of human life, at least as we know it today. So with the atomic bomb, the human race actually acquired a possibility to actually make ourselves extinct. As a remark, I'd like to say that it was exactly that insight that happened in the 1960s in a number of countries that caused that global reaction against nuclear weapon states, demanding a stop for the escalation, control over the arsenals, and disarmament. And that in the end then led to a number of treaties and a convention, but also important bilateral agreements between the US and the Soviet Union that significantly brought down the numbers of warheads from almost 100,000 down to roughly 12,000 that we have today. Then today we must ask ourselves, why did this happen? Well, of course, because of international pressure towards the nuclear weapon states, but also because the nuclear weapon states themselves, the United States and Soviet Union especially, realized that it wasn't in their interest either to keep on this arms race. The risks were too high and the costs were too high. And now I feel that we are going back again to that kind of arms race as we saw in the old days. But this time it's not just about 5 nuclear states, it's 9 nuclear states so far, and with the memories then from Hiroshima and Nagasaki fading. So once again, the red flag is there, the alarm bell is ringing. We have to hear what is happening and we have to react on that. I have 4 children. I don't want them to live in a world where we have 15 nuclear states or 20 nuclear states or 30 nuclear states, because in the end we know that that is not sustainable and that can very well end up in a very, very bad way. So once again, thank you for reminding us and for giving this presentation about what is actually going on. And I think that your work from SIPRI will be even more important in the coming years. I think the whole issue of nuclear weapons will be in the core of the international debate that we haven't seen before from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. It will come back in the core of the international debate, and that will also make SIPRI's work even more important. Once again, thank you, SIPRI, for this seminar, for your excellent work during these 60 years. You are telling us what the situation is, and you are giving your analysis, and it's now up to us to act on it and to hear it, because after all, as one of the founders of SIPRI, Alva Myrdal, once put it, it is not worthy for any human to give up. Thank you very much for this seminar.